The anticipation and build-up to the next mainline Final Fantasy is always unbearable. As soon as one releases and we get to the credit screen, we're already prepared for the next Final Fantasy. We're always ready for the next game in the series, and with Final Fantasy 15 meeting its untimely end with episode Arden, the last DLC for the game, all of our eyes now look forward to what the next epic adventure will be. The closest thing we have in the near future to serve that purpose is Final Fantasy VII Remake, but it seems like Square Enix may already be preparing for what comes after that. Back in March of 2016, we heard that Final Fantasy XIV director and producer Naoki Yoshida was working on a new project, and just recently Square Enix updated us with more information on that project being made for the next generation. This project is currently hiring to fill new positions, and the game aims to be a PlayStation 5 game. Currently, the only sneak peek we've been given of this is a concept art of an airship flying overhead. There's a vibrant world map below, which is very reminiscent of classic Final Fantasy, almost like something out of Final Fantasy IV, with a title over the image written in both Japanese and English stating, "A new project underway." Naoki Yoshida calls it a brand new key project that follows Final Fantasy XIV, and one that they see a challenge for in the next generation. He also added that its early development stage has already been completed, and they finished preparing it for its development environment, and are currently going into a full-scale development phase for a large-scale project. This makes sense as it's usually at this point that the hiring for a project tends to ramp up leading into the full-scale development phase. Yoshida has stated that he's looking to show what's fun and amusing to the world, and is recruiting developers who could help bring this surprise, and ends by saying, quote, "If you want to challenge the world market, then we look forward to your application." It's also important to note that recently Square Enix has restructured their business divisions. Naoki Yoshida previously belonged to Business Division 5, however, due to the restructure, him and his team are now known as the 3rd Development Division. This is not to be confused with the Osaka-based team Business Division 3, as that's the Kingdom Hearts team. The 3rd Development Division is currently seeking planners, designers, programmers, and a project manager to work on the project. Naturally, people are extremely curious to what Yoshida and his team are creating. Could him and his team quite possibly be working on Final Fantasy 16? They just might be. First and foremost, what stands out to me is that they aren't looking for any sort of network programming jobs, or anything to do with online or server development. It doesn't appear to be listed in any of the job requirements. They can't take away too much staff from the upkeep of Final Fantasy XIV, so you'd naturally expect they'd want to hire people for it. To me, that raises the possibility that the game could not be an MMO. It could actually be a single-player game. If that's the case, given the teaser art looking incredibly classic Final Fantasy-like, it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination to think him and his team could possibly be working on Final Fantasy 16. After all, Yoshida did recently state that he does not believe Final Fantasy 16 should be an MMO. He's also said before that he would never leave Final Fantasy 14, but he would direct the next mainline Final Fantasy if he was asked to by the company. Square Enix always begins the development of the next mainline Final Fantasy prior to the launch of next generation hardware, and most typically they unveil the next generation of Final Fantasy next to its hardware, or at the very least soon after the announcement of the hardware. This has always been the case dating all the way back to Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy XIII, and Final Fantasy XV, all being demonstrated alongside the hardware, although sometimes with a little bit of smoke and mirrors, and a little bit of pre-rendered CG. It would look very odd if Square Enix didn't do the same thing for Final Fantasy 16. On the other hand, if this game is an MMO, Yoshida has recently stated that he'd like to make another MMO someday that's not set in the Final Fantasy universe. He also said that he'd like to make that game before he dies. Kind of morbid. This could be that very game. But Final Fantasy XIV still has so much life in it and has a larger player base than ever. The game could easily last another generation. This may sound outlandish, but hear me out. Since he himself said that Final Fantasy 16 shouldn't be an MMO, it's also very possible that Final Fantasy 16 is being handled by an entirely separate team, which would actually make the game that he's working on Final Fantasy 17. This wouldn't surprise me at all, as Final Fantasy 13 14 and Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 were in simultaneous development. Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XI were also in simultaneous development. If that ends up being the case, we won't see this game for a very long time, if not to the tail end of the PS5's life cycle. Then again, just this past week, Yoshida said he was interested in creating battle royale games. That's right, something similar to Fortnite or Apex Legends. Yoshida said, "I'd like to create a battle royale game. I have some ideas to do that. I have some ideas to make that type of game fun. As an online game designer, I would like to make an MMORPG from scratch, without the limitations or restrictions. Removing all those restrictions, I'd like to make an MMORPG that fits the current trend before I die." But then he also said, "I would like to work on Diablo 4. So maybe it's not the best idea to put too much stock into everything Naoki Yoshida says, at the moment anyway." With that said, Naoki Yoshida is an absolutely legendary man. When Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 bombed, it was thanks to his efforts, ideas, and direction that the realm was able to be reborn, saving Square Enix from a catastrophic financial loss, and helping to repair the brand damage that was done by the original game's outing. If by some chance he's the one directing the next mainline single-player game in the series, I personally would be overjoyed. Though I greatly look forward to whatever he will be working on next. So, Ultima Weapons? Would you like to see Naoki Yoshida direct Final Fantasy XVI? Do you think it should be an MMO? Or do you think it should be a traditional single-player game instead? Or do you think this big next-generation project is something else entirely? Subscribe, click the bell icon, and let your thoughts be heard in the comments below. And if you've been loving my content, be sure to check out the Patreon for the Night Sky Prince. My awesome supporters like Steven M281 are what help me produce the highest quality Square Enix, Final Fantasy, and JRPG related content on the internet, and be able to do it as quickly as it happens. Shout out to him and the rest of the Ultima community. Link in the description below.